The liquid at the bottom of the bottle looked like rusted water, but it tasted like a slow, burning suicide. I remember the smell of that trailer, moldy drywall, unwashed laundry, and the sharp medicinal stench of the cheapest vodka money could buy in 2026. My hands were shaking so bad I had to grip the plastic neck with both paws just to get a drop to my lips. I was 52 years old, and I had successfully turned my entire life into a graveyard. No wife, no kids, no career, just a collection of broken promises and a liver that was finally throwing in the towel. My chest felt like it was being crushed by a hydraulic press. Every breath was a jagged piece of glass cutting through my lungs. I slumped against the grime-streaked wall, watching the flickering neon light of a liquor store sign across the street. I remember thinking, is this it? Is this the grand finale? A lifetime of being stepped on, cheated by friends, and discarded by the only woman I ever truly loved, all leading to a heart attack in a metal box on wheels. I closed my eyes, the darkness swallowing the room, and for the first time in a decade, I wasn't afraid. I was relieved. The pain stopped. The shaking stopped. There was just silence. Then came the gasp. It wasn't a gentle waking up. It was a violent, rib-cracking surge of oxygen hitting my lungs like a physical blow. I bolted upright, my heart hammering against my ribs with a rhythm so steady and powerful it terrified me. The air didn't smell like mold. It smelled like pine air freshener and hot upholstery. I wasn't on a stained mattress. I was in a car. I blinked, my vision clearing from the blur of death to the sharp, vivid reality of a sunny afternoon. I looked down at my hands. They weren't the gray, tremor-ridden claws of an old drunk. They were tanned, scarred at the knuckles from high school football, and rock steady. I looked in the rearview mirror and nearly screamed. The face staring back at me didn't have the deep-set bags or the broken capillaries of a lifetime of benders. It was me at 22. Thick hair, a jawline that could cut stone, and eyes that hadn't seen the horrors of the next 30 years yet. I looked at the dashboard. An old Ford F-15. Oh, on the passenger seat sat a crumpled receipt dated June 12th, 1996. 1996. I was back. 30 years of misery had been erased. Or maybe it was all a fever dream at the end of a long life. But the memories were too sharp. Hey, Jax, you falling asleep at the wheel or what? The light's green, man. The voice hit me like a bucket of ice water. I looked to my left. Sitting in the passenger seat was Miller. Mike Miller. In 2026, Miller was a billionaire real estate mogul who had built his empire by stealing my first tech patent and framing me for a crime I didn't commit, sending me into the spiral that led to the bottle. But right now, in 1996, he was just a scrawny kid in a backwards baseball cap, smelling like cheap weed and arrogance. "I'm awake, Mike," I said. My voice sounded different, deeper, resonant, lacking the gravel of a throat burned by spirits. "I'm more awake than I've ever been in my life." We pulled up to the lakefront. I saw the group gathered near the pier. There she was, Sarah. Mark was leaning against his shiny new Corvette, looking every bit the predatory prince of this small town. In my old life, seeing this would have sent me straight to the cooler for a beer. This time, I felt nothing but a cold, calculated hunger. "Jax," Sarah called out. "You're late." I ignored Mark entirely, looking directly at her. "Business? You mean hauling lumber?" Mark sneered. I didn't get angry. Instead, I smiled. "That's a nice car, Mark," I said. "Enjoy it while it lasts. Property taxes in this county are going to triple next year. Your dad's warehouses are sitting right in the path of the proposed environmental bypass." I turned to Sarah. "I'm not staying for the party. I have work to do. But I'd like to take you to dinner tomorrow, 7 o'clock. Be ready." I turned around and walked back to the truck. I could hear Mark shouting something behind me, but his voice sounded small. I got back into the F-150 and sat there for a second. My heart was racing, but it wasn't the racing of a dying man. It was the thrill of the hunt. I wasn't going to just survive this time. I was going to own everything. Every person who had laughed while I sank, every friend who had stolen my ideas, they were all going to pay. I started the engine. I had exactly 4 days before the first major market shift I remembered. I needed capital. I drove away from the lake, the sun setting in the rearview mirror. I reached into the glove box, found an old pack of cigarettes, and tossed the whole pack out the window. No more vices. I pulled over at a payphone, picked up the receiver, and dialed a number I hadn't thought about in 3 decades. The phone rang once, twice. On the third ring, a gruff voice answered. Hello? I took a deep breath, the cool 1996 night air filling my lungs, and I began to speak the first words of my new empire. The plastic receiver felt cold against my ear, a grounding weight that anchored me to this reality while my mind raced 30 years ahead. On the other end of the line, Arthur Vance cleared his throat. A rough, impatient sound. In the world I just left, Vance died a billionaire recluse. But right now, he was a disgraced engineer sitting in a basement in Palo Alto, clutching a patent for data encryption that everyone told him was worthless. I know exactly who you are, Arthur, I said, my voice cutting through his confused silence. And I know that by midnight, you're going to be staring at a foreclosure notice on your front door. I'm the only person on this planet who knows that your algorithm is the backbone of the next century. I have $10,000. It's not much, but it's enough to keep your lights on and buy me 40% of your soul. Do we have a deal, or do I call your competitors? There was a long pause. I could almost hear his heart rate spiking through the copper wires. He didn't ask how I knew his name or his debt. Desperate men don't ask questions, they look for lifelines. When he finally stammered out a yes, I hung up without saying goodbye. The first domino had been pushed. I spent the next 48 hours in a fever dream of calculated motion. I didn't sleep. I didn't need to. The adrenaline of knowing the future was a far more potent stimulant than any bottle I'd ever drained. I liquidated every asset my younger self possessed. The dusty tools in my shed, the vintage comic books I'd hoarded, even the truck I was driving. I gambled every cent on a high-stakes parlay at an underground sportsbook in the city, betting on an obscure boxing match and a blowout baseball game that I remembered solely because of how much money I'd lost betting against them the first time around. When the sun came up on Monday, I wasn't just a construction kid with a dream. I was a man with $60,000 in a duffel bag and a burning desire to watch the world bend to my will. I showed up at Sarah's house at exactly 7 o'clock. I wasn't driving the beat-up Ford anymore. I'd rented a black Lincoln Town car, the kind of vehicle that screamed old money, in a town that only understood chrome and loud engines. Sarah stepped onto the porch, looking hesitant. She was wearing the same yellow dress from the lake, but her expression had shifted from pity to genuine curiosity. "You look different, Jax," she whispered as I opened the car door for her. "Your eyes, they look like they've seen 100 years." "I just stopped blinking, Sarah," I replied, sliding into the driver's seat. "When you stop blinking, you start seeing the patterns in everything. The way people move, the way money flows, the way empires rise and fall in the blink of an eye. We didn't go to the local diner where the high school kids hung out. I drove her 40 miles out of town to a French bistro that required reservations 6 months in advance. Reservations I'd secured by simply walking into the kitchen and telling the owner exactly which health inspector was coming on Friday and which refrigerator coil was about to blow. Throughout dinner, I watched her. She was beautiful, yes, but in this life, I saw her as more than just a trophy or a high school sweetheart. She was a barometer for my own humanity. Every time she laughed, I felt a flicker of the old Jax, the one who just wanted to be loved. But every time I looked at the clock, I remembered the mission. I told her stories of trends I saw coming, masking my prophecies as gut feelings. I talked about a world where everyone carried a computer in their pocket and where borders didn't matter because the internet would erase them. "You're scaring me a little," she said, leaning across the table, her fingers brushing mine. "But I can't look away." "That's the point," I said. "Don't look away. The world is about to change, and I'm going to be the one holding the leash." As I dropped her off that night, the air was thick with the scent of jasmine and impending rain. I didn't kiss her. I didn't need to. I wanted her to spend the night wondering who I was, letting the mystery of my transformation take root in her mind until it was the only thing she could think about. The next morning, the highway leak I'd mentioned to Mark hit the local news. The town was in an uproar. I sat in a booth at the back of a smoky bar, watching the television as Mark's father gave a panicked interview about his warehouse properties. His face was pale, his bravado stripped away by the sudden realization that his empire was built on sand. Across the bar, Mike Miller was nursing a beer, looking shell-shocked. He saw me and walked over, his swagger gone. "How did you know, Jax?" he hissed, sliding into the booth. "Mark's dad is losing everything. People are saying you're a psychic or something. My dad wants to talk to you. He wants in on whatever you're doing." I looked at Miller. This was the man who, in 10 years, would testify against me in a court of law for a crime he committed. This was the man who would toast to my ruin while I sat in a jail cell. I felt a surge of cold, black joy. "I'm not a psychic, Mike," I said, leaning forward until our foreheads almost touched. "I'm just a man who stopped drinking the poison you guys were serving. And as for your dad, tell him I'm not interested in partners. I'm interested in employees. If he wants to save his shirt, tell him to meet me at the old shipyard tomorrow at dawn. And tell him to bring the title to that land he owns on the waterfront." "The shipyard? That place is a dump," Miller scoffed. "It's a dump today," I said, a slow, predatory grin spreading across my face. "Tomorrow, it's the center of a new world." I spent the rest of the week moving like a ghost through the city's financial district. I used my $60,000 to leverage a series of short-term options on tech stocks that were about to announce surprise quarterly earnings. By Friday, that $60,000 had become $400,000. By the following Tuesday, it was over $1 million. The physical toll was starting to show, though. My young body was strong, but my mind was vibrating with the frequency of 2 different lifetimes. I would close my eyes and see the gray walls of my 2026 trailer, then snap them open to see the marble floors of the hotel suite I'd moved into. I had to stay sharp. One mistake, one slip of the tongue, and the timeline would fracture in ways I couldn't predict. I began to realize that revenge wasn't just about taking things away from people. It was about building something so massive that their entire existence became a footnote in my story. I didn't just want Mark's father to go broke. I wanted him to work for me. I didn't just want Miller to be jealous. I wanted him to be dependent on my mercy for his next meal. I called a meeting at the shipyard. The morning mist was heavy, clinging to the rusted cranes and rotting piers like a wet shroud. Mark's father was there, looking 20 years older than he had at the lake. Miller was there, fidgeting with his cap. And a few other local heavy hitters had shown up, drawn by the rumors of the kid who could see the future. I stood on an old wooden crate looking down at them. I wasn't wearing construction boots anymore. I was wearing Italian leather, and the wind whipped my coat around me like a dark cape. "You're all wondering why I brought you to this graveyard," I began, my voice carrying over the sound of the crashing waves. "You think this land is worthless. You think the town is dying. But I see something else. I see a luxury marina. I see high-end condos. I see a data center that will power the entire state. And I already own the zoning rights." Mark's father stepped forward, his voice trembling. "That's impossible. Those rights haven't been issued in decades." "I bought them yesterday from the estate of the man who died in '84, I lied smoothly, knowing the paperwork would be finalized before they could even check. "Now, I'm going to give you all a choice. You can fight me and lose. Or you can hand over your holdings today for pennies on the dollar, and I'll give you a 5% stake in the future. You have 10 minutes to decide." As they huddled together, whispering in the fog, I felt a familiar sensation creeping up my spine. The old itch. For a split second, I wanted a drink. I wanted to numb the sheer intensity of the power I was wielding. I looked at my hands, expecting them to shake. They were steady as iron. I turned away from them, walking toward the edge of the pier where the water churned in violent, dark circles. The salt air stung my eyes, but I didn't blink. I stared out at the horizon, where the first light of dawn was beginning to pierce through the gray, and I realized that I wasn't just rebuilding my life. I was rewriting the laws of gravity for everyone I had ever known. A heavy footstep sounded on the wood behind me. I didn't turn around. I knew the sound of Miller's gait. I knew the smell of his cheap cologne. He stopped a few feet away, his shadow stretching out toward the water. "They're signing, Jax," he said, his voice hushed with a mixture of awe and terror. "They're actually signing it all over to you. What do we do now?" I reached into my pocket and pulled out a single gold coin I'd bought from a collector the day before. A coin from a shipwreck that wouldn't be discovered for another 10 years in the original timeline. I flipped it into the air, watching it catch the light before snatching it out of the sky and squeezing it tight in my fist. The gold was cold against my palm, a heavy reminder that in this world, value is whatever I say it is. I didn't look at Miller as I shoved the coin back into my pocket. I just watched the ink dry on those contracts, each signature a nail in the coffin of the men who used to look down on me. By noon, I owned the dirt they stood on. By sunset, I was already moving my pieces across a much larger board. The years began to blur, but not like they did when I was drowning in vodka. This was a sharp, high-definition blur of success. By 2001, the construction kid was a myth. I was the ghost in the machine of the tech boom. I sold my stake in Vance's encryption company just weeks before the bubble burst, walking away with a fortune that made my previous dreams look like pocket change. I didn't just have money, I had gravity. People, opportunities, and secrets all started falling toward me. I built my primary residence on the very cliff where Mark's father used to host his exclusive summer parties. I didn't just buy his house. I tore it down and built a glass and steel fortress that looked out over the ocean like a predator guarding its territory. I kept Mark's father on the payroll as a consultant, a fancy title for a man whose job was to fetch my dry cleaning and endure my silence. Seeing him age in real time, knowing he owed his mortgage to the boy he once called a lumber hauler, was a vintage better than any wine. But wealth has a strange way of complicating the heart. Sarah was still by my side, and we had married in a ceremony that made the local papers call us the king and queen of the coast. Yet I was living a double life. I wasn't just Jax, the successful mogul. I was a man haunted by a future that no longer existed. I would wake up in the middle of the night, reaching for a bottle that wasn't there, my throat parched with the ghost thirst of a dead man. To fill that void, I started collecting more than just companies. I became a patron of the arts, a benefactor to universities, and a man surrounded by a circle of women who were as brilliant as they were beautiful. There was Elena, a venture capitalist I met in London, and Juliana, a brilliant architect from Milan. They weren't just flings, they were intellectual peers who understood the language of power I was speaking. I provided for them, mentored them, and in return they gave me the adoration and the complexity I craved. Sarah knew, or perhaps she chose to look at the diamonds instead of the shadows. In this life, I had the resources to keep everyone in their own gilded cage, happy and oblivious to the fact that I was playing a game they couldn't even see. The drama of my private life became the fuel for my public legend. The media portrayed me as a Renaissance man, a visionary who could predict market swings with supernatural accuracy. They didn't know I was just reading an old script. The real climax came in 2008. I remember sitting in my private office, watching the ticker tapes turn red. The Great Recession was beginning, exactly as I remembered. While the rest of the world panicked, I felt a familiar, icy calm. This was the moment I had been waiting for since I gasped for air in that Ford F-15. Oh. I called Miller into my office. Over the years, he had become my right-hand man, the one who did the dirty work I didn't want my name attached to. He was terrified, his hands shaking as he looked at the plummeting numbers on the screen. "We're losing millions, Jax," he stammered, his face pale. "The real estate market is cratering. We need to sell. Now." I stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the city I practically owned. "No, Mike, we're buying. We're buying every distressed asset, every foreclosed home, and every failing bank we can get our hands on. I want you to leverage everything, every cent." "You're insane," he shouted, his old arrogance flickering back for a second. "You'll ruin us. We'll end up in the gutter." I turned around, and for the first time in a decade, I let him see the monster behind the mask. I stepped into his personal space, my voice a low, lethal whisper. "The gutter is where I came from, Mike. I know every crack in the pavement there. You, on the other hand, wouldn't last a week. You're going to do exactly what I tell you, or I will reveal where that missing pension fund money went last year. You think I didn't notice you skimming? I was just waiting for a reason to own you completely." Miller collapsed into a chair, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. He wasn't my friend. He never had been. He was just another asset I had been cultivating for the harvest. As the world crumbled outside, my empire grew tenfold. I was the vulture king, the man who bought the wreckage and sold it back as gold. I felt untouchable. I had the wives, the money, the revenge, and the power to rewrite history. I had reached the summit, but the higher you climb, the thinner the air becomes. One evening, I found myself alone in the penthouse of my New York hotel. A storm was raging outside, the wind howling against the glass. I poured myself a glass of water, staring at it as if it were the vodka that had once been my only companion. I realized that I had spent 15 years running away from a trailer park, only to build a much bigger, much more expensive prison. I checked my private line. A message had been left. It was from a private investigator I'd hired to track someone from my old life, someone I hadn't seen since the reset. A person who shouldn't have been important, but whose absence had been a nagging ache in the back of my mind. The investigator's voice was grim. "I found him, Mr. Sterling, but there's a problem. He says he knows you, not from the papers. He says he remembers the other 2026. He's waiting for you at the old shipyard." My heart did a slow, heavy roll in my chest. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Was I not the only one? Was my second chance a shared experiment? Or was the past finally catching up to the future? I didn't call for my driver. I grabbed my keys and went to the garage myself. I needed to see this for myself. I drove through the rain-slicked streets, the neon lights reflecting off the hood of my car like streaks of blood. The city looked different tonight, hostile, as if the buildings were leaning in to catch a glimpse of my downfall. I reached the shipyard. It was no longer a dump. It was the Sterling Marina, a pristine collection of yachts and high-end boutiques. But at the very end of the furthest pier, past the security gates and the luxury, there was a man sitting on a rusted pylon that I had intentionally left as a historical monument. He was wearing a tattered coat that looked out of place against the backdrop of my success. He didn't turn around as I approached. The smell of the ocean was thick, mixing with the metallic scent of rain and old grease. "You're late, Jax," the man said, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering across a sidewalk. "I've been sitting here for 30 years waiting for you to realize that you can't buy your way out of the ending." I stopped 10 feet away, my hand tightening around the steering wheel of my life. The wind ripped at my silk tie and the rain began to soak through my expensive wool coat, the cold seeping into my skin until it reached the very marrow of my bones. The rain turned into a biting sleet, pelting my face as I stood on the edge of my own creation. The man didn't move. He sat there, a ragged silhouette against the glowing neon of the Sterling Marina, looking like a glitch in a perfect photograph. I didn't recognize his face, but I recognized his posture, the slumped shoulders of a man who had carried the weight of 1,000 bottles. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice barely audible over the crashing surf. "How do you know about 2026? He finally turned. His eyes were milky with cataracts, but they held a terrifying clarity. "I was the one in the trailer next to yours, Jax. I was the one who found your body. But I didn't just find you. I followed you. When you took that first breath in 1996, I was waking up in my own past, 20 miles away. I watched you. I watched you build this fortress of glass and ego. I waited to see if you'd actually change, or if you'd just trade a cheap bottle of vodka for an expensive bottle of power." I felt a surge of nausea. The monopoly on time I thought I held was a lie. I wasn't a god. I was just a passenger on a bus that was fuller than I realized. "I did change," I hissed, gesturing to the billion-dollar skyline. "Look at this. I saved my family. I took down the people who destroyed me. I won. Did you?" He stood up, his joints creaking. "You spent 30 years looking over your shoulder at a ghost. You won by becoming the very thing you hated. You turned Mark and Miller into slaves because you were too afraid to forgive them. You bought wives like they were stocks. You're more addicted to control now than you ever were to the drink." He walked toward me, and instinctively, I stepped back. The predator was now the prey. "Today is the day, Jax. June 12th, 2026. The day your heart stopped in that trailer. You think you cheated death? You just delayed the bill. The universe doesn't like being cheated." He reached out and tapped my chest, right over my heart. "TikTok billionaire. What are you going to do with your last hour? Buy another company? Or finally try to be a human being?" He vanished into the fog before I could grab him. I stood alone on the pier, my chest tightening with a familiar, crushing pressure. It wasn't the sleet. It was the return of the hydraulic press. My heart skipped a beat, then another. I collapsed onto the wet wood, clutching my expensive coat, staring up at the luxury yachts that suddenly looked like plastic toys. I realized then that he was right. I had spent my second life building a monument to my own trauma. I had all the money in the world, but I was still that shivering drunk in the trailer, trying to prove I mattered to people who had been dead for decades. I struggled to my feet, gasping for air. I didn't go to the hospital. I didn't call my lawyers. I drove. I drove back to the old neighborhood, to the house where Sarah was waiting. I found her in the garden, looking at the roses. She looked at me, and for the first time in 20 years, I didn't see a trophy. I saw the woman I had manipulated into a life she never asked for. Sarah, I choked out, falling to my knees in the dirt. I'm sorry. I've been a ghost this whole time. I've been a liar. I told her everything. Not the business secrets, but the truth about the reset. I told her about the trailer. I told her that every prediction was just a memory. Instead, she knelt in the mud with me and held my head against her shoulder. I know, Jax, she whispered. I've known since that night at the lake. You didn't just stop blinking. You stopped feeling. The pressure in my chest didn't vanish, but it softened. I spent that final hour not as the Vulture King, but as a man. I called Miller and told him the blackmail was gone, that he was free to leave. I signed over the majority of my holdings to a trust for addiction recovery centers across the country, ensuring that the Jack Sterling legacy would finally be about healing instead of hoarding. As the sun began to rise on the morning of June 13, 2026, I sat on the porch with Sarah, watching the light hit the ocean. My heart didn't stop. The hour passed, and I was still breathing. The old man at the shipyard hadn't been a grim reaper. He had been a mirror. The death I was supposed to face wasn't physical. It was the death of the man I had become. By letting go of the control, by admitting the truth, I had finally broken the loop. I looked at my hands. They were older now, wrinkled and spotted with age, but they were calm. I didn't need the gold coin. I didn't need the revenge. I reached out and took Sarah's hand, feeling the warmth of another human being for the first time in 2 lifetimes. It's over, I said. To anyone listening, don't wait 30 years to wake up. Don't build an empire to hide a wound. Just live. Because in the end, the only thing you take with you is the love you were too proud to ask for. I leaned back into the chair, the weight of the world finally lifting off my shoulders as I watched the first real day of my life begin to unfold in the golden light of a future I no longer needed to predict.